the thing I want to explore is Arweave as an information processing system. Ooh, I guess I can't collapse that. Oh well. Um, at the very beginning, if you're new to this or just stumbling upon this video as a standalone thing, I want to just say, what is Arweave? Like, one sentence. It's a blockchain that provides scalable permanent data storage. That's the one sentence description. A very rough analogy is, you could think of it as, if you're familiar with storage system S3, which is part of Amazon Web Services, it's like S3 with an incentive structure and identities. There's a whole bunch of things wrong with that as as an analogy, but I think if you think in that direction, it's about right? It gets you very close. It's about as good as you can do, a short one sentence description analogy. So, and if the blockchain part turns you off, please just suspend that for a little bit and stay with me, because I think there's interesting things here even for people who are sort of, for whatever reason they have hangups, or I shouldn't say hangups. That's kind of loaded. Whatever. If you have reasons to dislike blockchains in general, it's fine. Just suspend that for a second and bear with me and follow along, thinking about Arweave as an information storage and processing system. Okay, so like I said, I gave some preliminaries earlier on. Part of the reason I'm doing this too is just to refine my own ideas. I think if I express them, it forces me to put a little finer point on them. And I think this way of thinking about Arweave, I don't hear discussed a lot. I hear a lot of talk about things like metaverse, Web3, sovereignty, censorship resistance. All those are pretty interesting in their own right, but other people are doing a good job talking about those. Whatever you think of them, like, no evaluation implied, but other people are talking about those quite effectively. But this information processing and storage angle, I don't think is talked about quite as much. And the reason I think this is really important is because I view Arweave as a tool for collective intelligence. And we could really use more effective tools for collective intelligence. Okay, just checking real quick on my comments there. Again, just repeating, I'm very interested in getting non-crypto people interested in Arweave. I think there's people who are turned off by crypto for a variety of reasons, many of which I find quite understandable. I want you to, if you're still staying with me here, just suspend that evaluation of crypto as a space in general and try to think about Arweave as its own thing. So yeah. Okay. So more preliminary intro stuff there. What I want to do in this video is talk about the properties of Arweave as an information storage and processing system, and sort of split out the different things that it does. I'm very interested in hearing feedback on this, both around if I've missed things or tied together things that shouldn't be, or maybe separated things that shouldn't be, although I think it's probably more the former. So please give me feedback on this if you think any of this is not clear, or you think there's important things I missed. So let's go through what I see as some of the essential properties of Arweave as an information storage and processing system. And at some point in the future, I'll probably talk about why I don't think you can really separate storage and processing, but I guess take that as a given in this one, that those things are tied together. Okay, so I'm going to go over some ideas. Some of these are so abstract, I found it kind of hard to come up with ways to express them in a way that I think will resonate with people, but I'm going to give it my best shot. And all the things I'm listing, I'm going to contrast Arweave and the web, the World Wide Web, if people still call it that, the web, the internet, the place that has all the websites that you go to, that thing. I'm going to contrast Arweave and the web on all these dimensions. And everything in this list is a property I think Arweave has, and the web has to some degree or not. And there's probably other things that you could also talk about, but these are some of the ones I think are the most important. So I'm going to go through them first. I'll talk a little bit about how they're realized in Arweave, and then I'll just go through my list of comparing and contrasting below in this table here. Okay, so let's talk first about the sort of foundational properties of information representation in a system. And I'm going to start out with the most difficult to express, but I think foundational properties of information representation. And that is the ability to have references and values in your system. References could also be called identities, but identities is kind of an overloaded term in a system where you also have cryptographic identities. So I'm just going to call them references. So what is a reference? So the best analogy I've come up with for a reference is, I shouldn't say analogy, it's an example, right? So if you're playing a board game, so let's say you're playing chess, you can think of the game as a reference. So a reference is a sequence of values through time. So what does that mean? So you can talk about a game, but there's no value for a game, right? Like you can look at a chess game and say, okay, here is the state of the game at a point in time. You know, we're on move 10, whatever. I'm not super into chess, so I don't know all the nomenclature, but whatever. You're some distance into the game, and the board has a state, right? Here are all the white pieces, here are all the black pieces, here are their positions. But that's not the game. Like the board state at a point in time is not the game. The game is really this sequence of board states through time. So you start in one state, you go to another state, you go to another state, you go to another state, and then finally someone wins, or just draw, whatever. And that whole thing, that progression through time of these values of the board state represents the game. So the game is a reference. It's representing a sequence of values through time. So what is a value? So a value is just a, in the game example, it's the state of all the things in the game, right? So you have the board, you have all the positions of the pieces, and the important thing about a value is you can't change a value. You can create new values. I could move a piece and say, okay, now we have a new game state. The game is now in this configuration. You haven't changed the old game state. If I had a time machine and I went back, that value would still be the same. What you've done is you've produced a new value. And it's the combination of this sequence of values and the fact that the values cannot change, which lets you represent information. I know that's all very abstract. In this video, I just want to define some of these terms and describe them as properties a system, an information processing system can or can't have. And then in a future video, I'll talk about the implications of some of these things. I think the implications are large. I will start out small and build to bigger conclusions. So some systems can't represent these things coherently. I would argue that the web kind of can't, and I'll get into that a little more in the table below. It sort of has a weak notion of references, and there's no notion of values. If that doesn't make sense, hold on, I'll get into it more. Okay, so another thing that's kind of implicit about having references and values is you need to have a notion of time. And that's time in terms of the information storage processing system itself. So in order to have a succession of values, you need to have time passing the system and the values changing over that time. So in a blockchain, time is built into the system. You have a sequence of blocks, and that represents the time of the blockchain. Again, this is something I think the web doesn't have at all. But I'll try to hold off on the contrast. But anyway, time is another notion you can have built into the system. Another kind of system that we often use that does not have a strong notion of time built into it is a relational database. So some people who are listening to this may or may not be familiar with a relational database, but a relational database is just, it's like a set of tables like Excel spreadsheets. You could think of it that way. And they're all related. You put data into it, and then you could do queries over those. There's no notion of how that data changes over time. When you look at the data, you don't know how it got there, when it got there, what past values of the data were. You just know that I'm looking at it right now, and that's what its value is right now. So there's no succession. There's no notion of time built into a relational database. Typically, there are databases that have time built in that are relational, but that's the common case is it's not. Or at least it's not a feature that people typically use. Like the big databases may all have some time extensions at this point, but it's not commonly used. Let's put it that way. Another very interesting property to have is global addressability, and this is something that the web has and Arweave has, although the way they do it is a little different. So by that I just mean I can give you a location or some way to find data in the system, and then it doesn't matter where you are, who you are, you can use that to uniquely find data in the system. I'll get into the contrast between Arweave and the web on that later. Another idea is provenance, and this could mean a lot of things, but in this context, I just mean you can associate identities with the data. So in Arweave, as is typical of the blockchain, no information gets into the system if it doesn't have a cryptographic identity associated with it. Now that doesn't mean it's a real person. It could be a program, it could be anything. It's just some cryptographic identity is associated with everything going into the system, and that means you can start to say things about those identities. What you can say is not the same as what you could say if you knew it was a person, who they are, that kind of thing. But it's a notion of attribution for the data that doesn't necessarily have to be there in a data storage system. Again, you can think of a relational database, like things going into a relational database or an Excel spreadsheet or whatever you want to, whatever analogy you want to use there. You could put a column in a database or in a spreadsheet that says who put the data in there, but it's up to the person doing it to make sure that's actually accurate and filled in, and it's not built into the system. With a blockchain, that's just there. Like you cannot get data into the system without having some identity associated with it. Okay, so those are kind of the foundational ideas that I want to talk about. And then there are some related supporting things that can go along with that. So immutability, I just want to put it out there. It's really a restatement of values. Values are immutable. You can't change a value. You can take a value, you can produce a new value that's derived from it, but values themselves are immutable. So I just want to put the word out there so you're familiar with the word. When someone talks about immutability, they're just talking about the fact that you can't change the data. And in some ways, I think this is the natural way to think of data. Like, I don't know, to non-programmers, I'm not even sure if this distinction makes sense. Like when you have data, like you say you have some piece of paper that has a bunch of information on it, you don't think of, or just the abstract idea of information, you don't think of going in and changing the information. You can produce new information, or you can go back and say, what I knew before was wrong, but you don't unknow the thing you knew. You just sort of, okay, it was a wrong thing, I'm going to replace it with this other piece of information. I think it's a distinction that's even hard to make if you haven't dealt with things that unmake the distinction. So permanence is exactly what it sounds like. If you put data into a system, are the guarantees that you can pull it out later? Most systems do not have this. I mean, if you put information into a computer, it's actually takes a lot of work to know that you can get it out later. I mean, if you record it on a hard drive or whatever, it might be there for a while, but you need to make backups to know that you'll actually have it in the future. And over the long term, lots of information is lost. So permanence is actually a pretty unique property. Arweave attempts to have that, and we'll talk more about that in the future. Snapshot ability. This is not a real word, but I guess it is for the purposes of this video. So if you have values, you have time, you have snapshot ability. And what I mean by that is you can, at a point in time, talk about what the value of the entire system is. So if you have a sequence of values progressing through time, you have a strong notion of time, everything has to happen in sequence in some way, then you can say at a point in time, what is the value of this entire system? That's a really unique property to have, especially at scale. And then is it public? If you put information in it, can other people get it out? And that's, if you're talking about collective intelligence, open knowledge, that's obviously necessary. It doesn't mean that you can't put private things into it. It just means that anything private that's in it has to be encrypted, so you have to have a secret to access it. But the data, in its encrypted form, is still publicly accessible. I could pull. There's tons of private data stored on Arweave that I could pull out. I just can't do anything with it because I don't have the secret that lets me access it. But by nature, it's a public system. Okay, so that's the foundational information properties, some of the derived or secondary things, and then I want to talk about a few fuzzier aspects of the system as a whole. So you could talk about, is the thing a platform? And by that I just mean, is it something you can build on? And I think this will be a little clearer when I do the contrast with the web below. So is something a platform? Can you build on it? Is it self-sustaining? Does it have an incentive built into it to perpetuate itself into the future? And is it scalable? And by scalable, I just mean that as adoption grows and usage expands, can the system accommodate it? Those are properties of the system overall, not necessarily properties of data storage in particular, just system properties. Okay, so now let's go through these things and contrast the web as we have it right now with Arweave. And I'm not trying to imply with this that Arweave is going to replace the web or that the web is bad. I think the web is, lots of sort of silly and bad things happen on the web, but I think the web overall is, one of humanity's great achievements, that we have this amazing collected collection of information that's available to everyone, at virtually no cost. That's amazing. But it's not perfect, and we can build new systems that have properties that the existing system doesn't have. They can coexist, they can complement each other, and naturally a lot of the new things that we can build, they wouldn't exist without the old things, and Arweave is built upon a lot of the technologies of the web. So just, I'm not trying to say like Arweave replaces everything. No, I want to have some point of contrast to talk about how these different properties are useful and manifest in these systems. Okay, so first, references. I would argue that the web, it has sort of a very weak notion of references. That might not be obvious at first because you go in your browser and you put in, google.com or whatever, your favorite website with a path at the end, and you get there, right? That seems like a reference. But it's a very weak reference. What it's actually referring to is, it's not referring to data. It's referring to a place. It's talking about some piece of hardware somewhere that is answering and serving up that query in response to you. And what you get out of it is not a value. It's just a bunch of bytes. And what I mean by that is, sure, I can go to a website, I can save the data from the website, and you say, well, why isn't that a value? Well, it's not a value because there's no way to go into the web and say, look, I got this thing out, and I have an ID for it. Can you give me that thing again? No, there's no way to do that. You can save a copy of it, and you can argue that the copy you saved is a value, but the system has no way to refer to values by identifier. So I can't go into the web and say, give me Google's webpage in December of 2005. And here's the ID I have for it. I save the ID, give that back to me. There's no way to do that. So yes, you can refer to things by name, and that's certainly a useful property, but it's not really references in the sense that I'm talking about with the information storage and retrieval system. They're not things that associate a succession of strongly identified values over time. Arweave, I would say, does have references. Forget about that. I put work in progress here because some of the references in Arweave are still, they're not fully defined in terms of Arweave. So to get the things on Arweave right now, you're still using DNS, but there's no reason you can't have names that are defined purely within Arweave itself. So right now I might go somewhere and there's DNS lookup that gets me, some address, and then the address talks to Arweave and gives me a thing back. In the future, I might just natively say, here's a name that is associated with a thing in Arweave, give me that thing. And that's really a strong reference. That's a identity for a thing. Sorry, I said identity. That's a reference for a thing that's in Arweave that's associating a sequence of values, that's associated with a sequence of values in Arweave over time. So I think there's nothing preventing us from getting all the way there with things in Arweave. I just think there are some pieces missing that, we should build, right? Does the current web have values? Already touched on that. I would say no. Arweave does. Like, the whole thing is built on values. If you have a transaction ID, whether it's a bundle transaction or a top-level transaction, you're guaranteed that that's always going to give you the same data over time. Immutability. Again, this is a big problem. I mean, this is when people talk about Arweave, they talk about like censorship resistance and being able to know that data hasn't changed. It's a big problem with the web right now that, say, some publication goes in and changes stuff, or some government goes and changes things. Stuff can just change out from under you. You don't know, and you can't refer to immutable things in the current web. Arweave, that's just built in. Again, it's just a property of values. Permanence. This is one that, the current web doesn't have this at all. Right? The permanence of data is reliant on people just maintaining copies of it, right? And I will say there's a strong social incentive for lots of people to do this. You have things like the Internet Archive, and people who just maintain their websites over long periods of time doing this, but it's just a social incentive. There's no actual incentive built into the system to have permanent data, and there's really no way of referring to permanent data in the web. It's just that people put in a lot of effort because permanence is that valuable that people will put in effort over time to make things permanent. This is built into Arweave. There are caveats. So if you think about a permanent data system, people could put very bad things, like damaging things in it. Just use your imagination. Like, people can put stuff into there that you definitely do not want to serve up as someone running a node in the system. So there's a caveat in that people can choose not to store data if it's truly objectionable, but there's also a reward in the form of Arweave tokens with storing any data. So there's a sort of balance between if the content is objectionable enough, I think the network will tend to forget it, but it has to reach a certain threshold. And I'll probably get into this more in the future. I think for any data that has any utility, even if it's very controversial, and maybe certain governments don't like it or that kind of thing, I think there's a very, very strong incentive for anything that is at all reasonable to stay in Arweave forever. And I'll hopefully explore that more in a future video. Snapshot Ability, again, you gotta have values for that. So no, the web doesn't have that. Google would love it. We would all love it, right? Like, we could build indexes that are good forever of the web if it was snapshotable, but it's not. Arweave is. So if you index, a past piece of Arweave, that index is accurate forever. You can always read that index in and use it to build new indexes of even more of Arweave, but it's never going to be wrong, to the extent that it was right when you made it. And that's a very powerful thing. So public, this is one of the amazing things about the web and Arweave. They're just public systems. Anyone can put stuff on them. That's amazing. Like, the fact that I can put stuff on it, anyone in the world can read it, is just mind-blowing. We take it for granted, but that's a very new thing in human history, that I can publish and interact with people anywhere in the entire world as an individual who's, in the grand scheme of things, basically a nobody, right? That's amazing. Both the web and Arweave do this. I would say that it's a little easier potentially in the future with Arweave, but they're both good at this. Global addressability. Okay, so again, this is getting back to references. So what kind of references do you have in the web? You have these weak references. And what are they referring to? They're really referring to places. They're referring to servers. So yes, you have global addressability in that I can put Google into my browser and get to it anywhere. But it's referring to a place. It's referring to some servers somewhere. And as we just saw, like Facebook just made this quite clear, right? If someone does something that screws up the networking for those servers, it's globally addressable, but it might not be there. Arweave has global addressability in the sense that you can address actual pieces of data and actual pieces of data and references to data. And that's a different kind of global addressability. So they both do this, but they're addressing different things. And the data addressability, I would argue, is much more powerful than the place addressability. Provenance, the web really doesn't have this. The closest thing you have is server certificates, but that's really talking about securing communication. It's not really talking about signing content. And it could be that there's some web standard about signing content too, but like I've never seen, I can't really think of a case where I've seen that used, except maybe in a corporate context, if it exists at all. I'm trying to think if that's a thing, but basically in practical terms, no, there's no provenance for stuff in the web. People may put their names on things, but there's no strong association. It's not a property of the system that associates identities of any kind with the content. This is just baked into Arweave. Is it a platform? I put a question mark here really just to be provocative. The web is a platform, but I think it's the web is old enough that we may forget what kind of platform it is sometimes. I think I do this a little bit unconsciously, so I'll just speak for myself that sometimes, we forget what kind of platform it is because we built so much stuff on top of it. So the platform in the web, what is it, right? It's a agreement on a bunch of protocols and standards. So at the bottom you have TCP/IP, you have HTTP, you have DNS. Then you have the browser standards, how do we render HTML and CSS? You have JavaScript, you have all these things together, and that's making the platform that is the web. And there's strong social agreement around it, and it definitely is a platform. So the question mark is just trolling you a little bit. But what kind of platform is it, right? If I want to participate in this platform, what do I have to do? Well, ultimately, someone has to run some hardware for me. And my relationship with that entity is different than my relationship with the protocols. The protocols just are, and they exist because of social consensus around them. The entity that's being the platform for me to put content on the web, that's a contractual relationship of some sort. I could run my own server, but almost no one does that. And so usually they build on other people's servers. In one way or another. And that entity that's running the servers, that's just contractual. They can stop that. They can decide that they don't want to host my stuff. And that's the platform we're typically interacting with. It's this sort of contractual platform with companies and individuals running things on our behalf. Arweave is a platform at a different layer. So clearly people have to run the hardware, but the incentives for running the hardware are provided by the network, and the platform I'm building on is the network. So I don't go to an individual and say, you want to run a server for me, do it. I say, I want the network to provide me with this service, and the network handles dispensing incentives to the people to run the services on it. So it's a different layer of platform. So they're both platforms, but different layers, and the I don't know if I want to say that the Arweave layer is a higher layer. I don't know if I would say that, but as an individual, if I want to put content on it, having to run hardware is a very high barrier. Having to run hardware and know how all that works so that your hardware actually does useful things. While there's usability problems around participating in these crypto networks right now, ultimately, we have a good way to manage the keys. Pretty much anyone can participate. And I think it's interesting with Arweave. So I guess I shouldn't go on tangent there. I think there's some things that make Arweave sort of easier to participate in than crypto more broadly, because the value of Arweave isn't predicated on you treating it as a currency. So you don't necessarily need to worry about managing your keys as much, right? Like I could just have a key that's like a burner key where I put some Arweave tokens into it. I use it to post content, and then I'm done with it. Like I could lose it accidentally or whatever. It doesn't really matter. The content's still there. So in some ways, I think the barrier to entry for individuals who just want to put content on the network is lower with Arweave versus the web. But in practice, there's a whole bunch of usability issues around that. So again, trolling slightly here, is the web self-sustaining? I would say yes, the web is self-sustaining, but it's self-sustaining in a different way than Arweave or a blockchain network. So it's self-sustaining because the utility around these, around the set of protocols that is the web is so, they're so valuable that everyone continues to agree and form consensus on them. Arweave has a different level of self-sustainingness built into it, where there's economic incentives directly built into the protocol to sustain it into the future. Now, I put a big asterisk around that because Arweave is only a few years old, very young system, could fail for any number of reasons, or it could just be sidelined, whatever. So it certainly hasn't achieved the longevity of the web yet, but if it can last for a while, I would argue that the kind of incentives that it has are stronger in some ways than the current web, although they may have some downsides too. So the current web can keep evolving, and Arweave may be more locked into its final form at some point, which makes it useful to build on, but means that it may evolve less than some of the other things. So but that's okay. I think you can have multiple systems, and they all can compete and interact with each other in different ways. Finally, scalability. Clearly, the web has achieved astonishing scale, and Arweave has not yet. But based on my own inspection of it, I don't think there's anything in the protocol that prevents it from achieving scale. I think it's mostly a matter of engineering to achieve scale. So I don't think there's any theoretical reason it can't achieve very large scale. But the engineering does take work. It's not a given that it will succeed. But given the rest of these properties, I think we should try to make it succeed if we can, or make something that has the same properties succeed. But Arweave is the only thing I know of that has all these properties currently. So yes, I think it can succeed. And I should also say, with all of this stuff, don't take my word for it. I hope to explore how some of these things work in the future. But you're welcome to, if you think this set of properties sounds interesting, go and dig into Arweave yourself and see if you think it can do these things. With the caveat that it's a work in progress, and I think it will keep improving. So some of these guarantees are stronger or weaker than others. Okay, so that's mostly what I wanted to do in this first video. Just give you sort of an overview of what I see as the central properties of Arweave as the information storage and processing system. In future videos, I want to go into more about how I think these things fit together and form a platform for collective intelligence. I'm going to start quite modest and build up to, crazier and crazier conclusions, and we'll see how far I can bring people along with me in this tower of ideas. I think I'll mostly focus on that initially, because I think if those things grab your attention, you can always go dig into the protocol and figure out if you can do these things yourself. I mostly just want to get people thinking about what can be achieved if there is a system that has all these properties. And you shouldn't take my word for it that Arweave is that system, at least until I explain in detail why I think it can do some of these things. Always go check and see if it can really do these things yourself. But either way, I hope to inspire people to imagine what could be built on a system like this, whether or not that system is Arweave. I'll leave you with one closing thought here. So if you've been doing software development for a while, or maybe you haven't, maybe you have always existed in the land of version control, and if so, yay for you, because that is a happy place to be. But there was software development, or at least there was software development before many people used version control, and I've experienced that. And I would argue that that's really where we are in terms of collective knowledge management. We are in the pre-version control, revision control version of collective knowledge management. I think Arweave, or a system that has the properties of Arweave, brings us into a world where we can start having knowledge management, global collective knowledge management with revision control. And I'm not going to dig into the implications of that now, but I think if you have experienced with, especially working in groups, managing software with and without that, it may turn some gears in your head about, what may be possible if we can realize that at scale. Okay, so that's it for this kind of overview of Arweave as an information processing system. I'm really interested to hear feedback on this. The things I'm most interested in is, I know production value could be improved. I could be more fluid in things I say. I could add more graphics. I could do any number of things to improve it that way. That's fine. If you have tips on that, I'm not opposed to hearing them. But the things I really want to know is, are the concepts clear? Did I miss concepts? Do you think there's things I misexplained? That's sort of the critical feedback part. And then, is this valuable? Did you get something out of it? I'm not looking for pats on the back there, just some indication of, yes, this is content I would like to see more of or hear more of, versus, no, you're kind of wasting your time, because it takes some work to prepare this stuff. So if I want to put more effort into it, I'd like to know that it's useful for people.